Hello, everyone. Can you see me all right? Welcome to the American Association of Biological Anthropologists and Leakey Foundation Communication Award Lecture in honor of Camilla Smith. I'm Brianna Pobener, a research scientist and museum educator in the Human Origins Program of the Smithsonian National Museum of Natural History and last year's Communication Award laureate. Today's program, Games, Stories, and Science for Successful Public Engagement, features this year's laureate, Dr. Katie Hinde. She is Associate Professor in the School of Human Evolution and Social Change at Arizona State University and creator of the science communication campaign, March Mammal Madness. We invite those of you watching this program live to post comments or questions in the chat, and we will answer them during the program. We'd like to thank our generous sponsors, the Ann and Gordon Getty Foundation, Camilla and George Smith, the Brown Foundation Incorporated, and the Joan and Arnold Travis Education Fund. We'd also like to give a special shout out to those who donated at the science supporter and evolution enthusiast levels. Donations made in association with this program support science communication and outreach professional development. Now, Leakey Foundation trustee Camilla Smith will say a few words about tonight's program.
Thank you, Dr. Probner. I am Camilla Smith, co-chair of the Leakey Foundation's Communications Committee. The Communication and Outreach Award recognizes the importance and urgency of promoting scientific literacy and fostering respect and understanding of evolution, particularly the evolution of humans and their living and fossil relatives. It's important that the public have access to quality education, that teachers have tools and resources, and that students are inspired to be scientifically curious. I am thrilled that this award is named in my honor, and I congratulate this year's laureate, Dr. Katie Hinde, for her outstanding outreach efforts and creativity, as she does this by showcasing animals, ecology, and behavior to thousands each year. And she does this through March Mammal Madness, which is a program to entertain and encourage science for children. Now, I invite Dr. Katie Hinde to take the virtual floor. Thank you so much.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for that incredibly kind introduction. And I'm so honored and delighted to be here to speak about science communication and science engagement, because increasingly we're seeing that this is a vital component of our role as 21st century scholars. And as a life scientist, as a social scientist, there is an increasing amount of research that can be brought to bear to improve how we reach myriad audiences and stakeholders who have interest in and can benefit from the science that we as scholars are engaging in. So thank you for the opportunity to speak tonight, and I'm so honored to have been recognized with this award, and thank forever my nominators. So without further ado, let's share the slides. Tonight I'll be talking about games, stories, and science for successful public engagement. And what we know from the evolutionary social sciences, that there's a great deal of guidance for informing how we conduct our science communication, or SciComm. So the human mind is adapted to have learning biases, content biases, delivery biases, the source biases, the community, and the emotional valence of how we're learning. And so kind of the shorthand for that is that we have a bias for social learning. We are adapted, our minds are cognitively adapted to be particularly interested in learning about animals and nature, and art is a particularly salient pathway for learning. How things are delivered can be quite important. So when we learn socially through stories, through the illustrations of others, those learning settings tend to improve our retention of knowledge. We have source biases, where we tend to be more likely to be willing to be guided by trusted experts. And that is a two-part thing, right? So it's not enough to have expertise. It's the ability to trust the individuals who are expressing the expertise. And we can see that this can quite often break down where people trust non-experts, or there are experts who are not well trusted. And so understanding how to become a trusted expert is quite important. We as humans are incredibly social. We engage in unparalleled amounts of cooperation within the animal kingdom, and are really adapted for having collective experiences be quite important for us. And lastly, it's, I think, really important to recognize that the emotional valence, our emotion state during a situation where there's potential for learning, is really important. And it's not just that it has to be positive, but it does have to be emotionally engaging. And so you can have, I call this excitement, because it's both. You can be excited in happiness. You can be very, very excited in disappointment, right? So if you think of any kinds of, if you're a sports fan, you can think about how a particular game went, where your favorite team won or lost. Regardless, it likely created a substantial amount of excitement if it was a very close kind of game. And so we know that if we shape our science communication with these kinds of learning biases and other sorts of cognitive biases in mind, we're going to be able to have greater resonance with our stakeholders and audiences. And we have to also be very careful that this is not just a one direction kind of dynamic, because when scientists listen and respond to feedback from stakeholders, from audiences, from collaborators in learning, then we're able to develop something that I think is deeper than science communication, which is we're able to achieve sustainable engagement with diverse stakeholders. And I think that as we grow this area of our field, we're going to see much more movement toward prioritizing engagement beyond just communicating. And I think it's quite important that we think about what it means to be a scholar in the 21st century, and what are often seen as scholarly activities are typically directed toward very restricted sorts of audiences. So our academic articles, the ways in which we engage in peer reviewing and editing, mentoring, the conference presentations we deliver, sometimes we create textbooks for students. We engage in committee service, teaching courses. We do interviews with media, sometimes just as background, sometimes providing quotes. We do consulting, and we attend conferences, but these are always going to necessarily be somewhat restricted audiences. And technology and kind of expanded networks have changed our ability to engage in broadcast communication. So we can now write public-facing essays and blogs, engage in different platforms for social media that are ephemeral or persistent. We can contribute to documentaries. We can do virtual, public, or kinds of public audience talks, podcasts, online MOOC kinds of teaching settings, the media quotes that are outward facing, publicly available, op-eds, and we can participate in any number of very exciting festivals and events. And so one of the things that I think it behooves us is to understand that amongst all these things, it's unlikely that any one person can do all of them or develop expertise in all of them, but that we need to think somewhat intentionally in how we build our scholarly portfolio such that we are reaching our many relevant audiences, and to also further recognize that these scholarly activities rest upon a kind of deeper foundation of the principles, cultural values, philosophies, vision, and particular mission that shapes who we are as scholars and what we are accomplishing with our scholarship. And I think sometimes we can get so focused on the specific scholarly activities that we sometimes don't take every opportunity to step back and revisit how these sit atop our personal embedded broader foundations. And as we diversify our academy, we're going to see much more diversity of the kinds of cultural anchorings that shape the activities, and have to think inclusively about recognizing diverse philosophies and values and missions as we improve our academy. Now, real quickly, I want to give a kind of worldwide version of social science, where we kind of think about what have we learned as social scientists about community and learning and cooperation, and how stories about nature and the use of games and art speak to this. And so this is going to be kind of a whirlwind kaleidoscope of key research with lots of citations, and some really incredible scholars that are really lighting the way in this space. So not shockingly, I think it's really important to recognize that humans are deeply social and have been for hundreds of thousands of years, and our lineage of hominins are characterized by specific evolution and adaptation for complex social behavior. And that humans are fundamentally social learners. So this is work by Michelle Klein and Dan Grunspan, who really brought a kind of culture evolution perspective to pedagogy and teaching, and really recognize that we learn from those we perceive as successful, who we think are knowledgeable, with whom we share identities, and with whom we have access to. And so this is quite important, and why it's really essential that we make an inclusive academy, and that we make inclusive science communication, so that we can collectively bring all relevant stakeholders to the table. Children are cognitively adapted to socially learn about nature. So this is work by Clark Barrett and Annie Wirtz and colleagues that show that there are very specific learning biases for children to have better retention, learning about dangerous and toxic animals, that children are, quite young children are, have learning biases toward edible and toxic plant information, and learn it better when it's presented in a social context. And so there's clearly from early in life an adaptive cognitive architecture for learning about nature. Humans are storytellers and story listeners. We have myriad anatomical, neurobiological, cognitive, and cultural capacities for language, cooperation, and it's been speculated by researchers like Polly Wiesner that control of fire afforded human social groups extended hours of socializing. And in that extended period of socialization and evenings of periods of rest but creative engagement, this really opened a virtual world of the imagination, of ritual and stories. And this, of course, was published in 2014, but she was not the first one to talk about this. We know from Felix Boateng and Harriet Mitonyi that stories are bridges across generations. And when you look at the cultural practices around stories, they often weave together the cultural practices and expectations morally for individuals within a population culture, but also weave together aspects of the natural world. So most of these fables, which also served as sources of entertainment, were told during moonlit nights, and children would go to bed with the most of the lessons vividly in their minds. All attempts were made to make the storytelling interesting and entertaining. Stories, proverbs, and anecdotes are cultural tools used in indigenous communities to teach children about their environment. And when we look across different cultural groups and look at the stories, and especially like pedagogical teaching stories, animals feature prominently in many oral traditions, fables, and folklore. Traditional stories often include fitness-relevant information for predator avoidance, hunting success, safe navigation through ecosystems, and as well, the human practices for social behaviors for sustained cooperation with other members of your community. There's wonderful, wonderful work done across Proto-Indo-European languages, looking at fairy tales across this Eurasian gradient, and many of them have to do with animals, and 4 fairy tales were inferred to be present in the last common ancestor of all Proto-Indo-European languages. And the 4 stories are all about animals or monsters. So the boy who steals ogre's treasure, the animal bride, the grateful animals, and the smith and the devil. And I think many of us are familiar with different versions of the smith and the devil, right? So whether we're talking about the devil in Dr. Faust, or Robert Johnson making a deal with the devil at the crossroads, or a fiddle competition in Georgia, or this cartoon from the 70s about Daniel Mouse that I remember from my childhood, that these are hundreds of human generations old, dating back possibly as much as 5,000 years ago, about making a deal with this kind of supernatural creature for incredible power. Humans learn from stories. All right, we know that through narrative, learners are transported across time and space. They're able to draw inferences and engage in inferential learning, and they experience emotions. They become excited by the events of a story as it unfolds. And what we know from a teaching and learning perspective is that information and narrative is easier to comprehend. People are able to read it faster. It's better recalled, and inconsistencies are more readily detected. So the story narrative is a really, really powerful way of engaging human minds. Narrative-centered learning promotes learner self-efficacy. It increases interest in presence. And because the story being told is also being recreated in the mind of the listener, there's a perception of aspects of control. So like for me, when I watch a very scary movie and it's at the moment of peak suspense, I really try to reduce my sensory perception by either closing my eyes or blocking my ears, so that I don't have multiple pathways of information coming in. Further to this, we know that art, game elements, and excitement improve learning. And so let's kind of focus in just a little bit about the art component of this, because I think it's quite spectacular. For tens of thousands of years, humans have created artistic representations of animals, and these are present on every continent, which humans have lived on, so not Antarctica. And when we look at these cave art or other kinds of rock art, carving, statues, depictions, we see physical and behavioral traits of animals. We see predator-prey dynamics of animals. There's life history stages. So in this sand rock art in the upper left-hand corner, there's a baby elephant following after what is presumably a mother elephant. They are representations of animal group compositions, so bachelor groups of bison, or multi-generational female groups of elephants, for example. And correlations between the depictions in rock art and paleo assemblages of ecosystems have demonstrated that the artwork is correlated with the presence of these animals in the environment as humans were creating it. So these traditional ecological knowledge systems are oftentimes communicated to children through illustration or other kinds of artwork. And so here's a photograph that I took in the center of Australia at the base of Uluru, and this was a children's classroom and was used for tens of thousands of years, and there's artwork layer on top of artwork layer on top of artwork layer. I want to draw people's attention to this amazing program by Professor Catherine Quinlan at Howard University. She's put together, I think, an incredibly stupendous lesson plan on African rock art. So this includes a teacher guide for image analysis, video clips, a slide deck, student handouts, and then the materials and methods that you do for exploring making pigments, and then using those pigments to create artwork with students, and really showcasing a broad heritage around this kind of illustration and natural world knowledge that allows a teacher to explore earth science, Paleolithics, ecology, and cultural practices at grade specific stages. So having kind of done that very rapid showcase of what we know about the cognitive biases for learning certain content and from certain teachers, and how this all works, I'd like us to spend the next 25 minutes or so really discussing a case study called March Mammal Madness. And we just celebrated our 10th annual tournament in 2022, and it really showcases so many of the principles I just outlined. So some fast statistics of why you might be inclined to learn about this from somebody that contributes to March Mammal Madness. In 2022, over 6,000 teachers signed up for the educator materials that we provide along with the tournament bracket. Our year-over-year learner growth is over 50%. In 2022, we estimate that we reached 2 to 3% of public middle and high school students in the United States. And this is distributed in proportion to the student population geographically. So, the 6,000 plus teachers that signed up for these educative materials in an IRB approved survey of those educators, they reported to us that they plan to distribute those materials to 615,000 learners in a variety of settings. And when we asked them what geographical regions they were from, this matches the Department of Education statistics for public school students. So this has grown into an incredibly successful program that has really far reach among student learners in the United States. And it really just started from, I think, what is a very common, spontaneous kind of question that shows up called, like, who would win between two animals? So here you can imagine, like, who would win, a brown bear or a lion? And this isn't a recent question necessarily. So you can see depictions of animals engaged in mortal combat, in stonework, in tattoos, in deep within the archaeological record. These kinds of questions of predator-prey dynamics or competitor dynamics are quite common. And then, of course, it is also quite recent because you have people like Cardi B earlier this year in February asking who's winning in a fight, a lion or a silverback gorilla. And so these I think are quite kind of common imaginary kinds of contingent discussions that people can spontaneously engage in. And we take that tendency and we turn it into a much more structured science engagement activity. So every late February, early March, we release a bracket that has 65 species that have been selected to fit into 4 novel divisions created for that year. And we hand this out, make this publicly available as an open educational resource online. And so you can imagine if a teacher walked into a classroom with a list of 65 species and said, do research on how big they are and what they eat and what their adaptations are and what their conservation status is and where they live in kind of spreadsheet, like that would be a very onerous, busy work completion task, right? It would be very regurgitative and quite, I would find it quite onerous, and I think most learners would too. But if you take that same constellation of species and instead put it in a bracket and then say, who do you think would win? All of a sudden you've asked a learner to think in all these contingencies, and it changes entirely the motivation around it. So we can zoom in here on the Wild North America division from 2022, and you had kind of matchups like grizzly bear versus it was a small bat that made it into the tournament from the play-in game, gray wolf versus badger, mountain lion versus kit fox, jaguar versus marsh rabbit. And so then, whoever wins that, you say, okay, then they go on to the next round, and then they have to encounter another animal. And so you basically have to think in multiple contingencies and in very dynamic sorts of ways. And when we kind of design these divisions, they are there to address many different kinds of educational kinds of topics. So we had mammal collectives. So the collective nouns is a quirk of English, dates back at least 500 years. So pride of lions, skulk of foxes, and labor of moles are all in the Book of St. Albans, which is from the 1400s. And, when we look back at those much older natural history books, they tend to not be as well evidenced as the work we do now. And so sometimes collective nouns were created for animals that are not able to sustain social interaction or do not live in social groups. And so this was a fun chance to explore the English language, but also kind of push people to think about, well, are these animals going to be able to cooperate? Are they going to work as a team, or are they going to collapse under stress and challenge? We had Wild North America talking about particular populations within North America, both including the US, Canada, and Mexico. We had a division of species that are characterized where selection has shaped females to have particular adaptations for exaggerated abilities. And then we had a really interesting division of species that had atypical combinations of muntjac. So you may say tusks or antlers, and the muntjac says, why not both? And we populate these divisions with interesting species and provide an opportunity to explore the tree of life. So this is an annual tournament. And once we've put together the bracket as the scientists that are organizing it, we do research kind of estimating a winner of an outcome probabilistically based on their weaponry, their temperament, their armor, their motivation, their fight style, and any special skills that they may have. We then input that probability within a random number generator. So upsets are unlikely, but they do happen. And then once we know that outcome, the scientist narrators use that information, use information from the scholarly literature to craft a story about the encounter that explains the outcome. And this is then delivered as a play-by-play performance on Twitter, like the exciting days of radio. And amazingly, it actually works very, very well. As a player, when you get the bracket, you know that there's some certain specific rules. So you should expect that the animal that is fighting is a peak condition specimen of that species. That the battles aren't necessarily to the death, and we don't create stories where the animals are forced to fight, right? If we're excited about animals' adaptations for combat, those include adaptations to de-escalate an encounter, or to not waste energy in a risky battle, or not be distracted from something of much greater importance. And so animals can run away, they can hide, they can get displaced, they can walk away to do something else, and all of these count as a defeat. And we make it very clear that these battles are situated within a particular habitat. So in the first 3 rounds, the better ranked species gets home habitat advantage. And in the advanced rounds, there's 1 of 4 randomized locations that the battle could take place in. And so the students or the learners have to think very carefully, the players, about, what is the probability that the habitat that the animals will be in the advanced rounds are going to favor or disfavor their abilities. So the battle is presented in kind of a systematic way. Typically, we depart that recipe on occasion, but you kind of discuss the combatants. You set the scene of the battle. So here's the main rat versus the platypus. The battle took place in Tasmania. The platypus had home habitat advantage, and the battle took place at the St. Clair Lake National Park, and which was described. And then there's a play-by-play. And many times in this story, there's a moment of great reveal. So this could be some foreshadowing in the background, or there's a reveal during the battle, or there's a twist. And this kind of being embedded increases the excitement, but also better facilitates learning the twist. So an example would be people were really excited about the platypus because the males have a venomous spur, and this was a lot of people's dark horse in the tournament, that it was going to be some surprise champion because it's one of the few venomous mammals, which is very cool. But if you just rely on Wikipedia for this, you won't know that the venoms, the glands that make the venom, are only active during the mating season. And the mating season is not in March. So the platypus is shooting blanks. And in this kind of play-by-play reveal, we include the figure from the scientific publication that shows the quiescence of the crural venom gland. So this is a big kind of, this is why the scientist telling the story is an added value over just kind of easily navigable information. This is buried in the scientific scholarly literature and generally not accessible. And so this, of course, creates a very dramatic response from players that are watching in real time on social media. And this speaks to the point about how excitement is quite important. It doesn't just have to be happiness excitement. It can be disappointment excitement. And what ended up happening is it wasn't just that the platypus had, was shooting blanks with its venomous spurs, but it was fighting a maned rat, which has a really, really, really thick dermis and is actually impenetrable to things like dog teeth, right? So it has a really, really thick sides, in part because of its defensive strategy of putting poison on its sides and trying to get predators to like bite them so that the poison gets delivered. And then the numbness and reaction to the poison allows the maned rat to escape. So it was an opportunity to talk about like two sets of adaptations that really favored the maned rat, and the maned rat ended up defeating the platypus and advancing in the tournament. And people had a lot of feelings about that. This is one of my all-time favorite player reactions. This was the championship battle in April 2020, the only sporting event to not be canceled as the COVID-19 pandemic crashed upon the United States. And one of the play-by-play suspenseful tweets is all of a sudden gorilla is screaming, right, with many exclamation marks, because that is how I talk and tweet. And Blake is like, good screaming, which always makes me crack up because usually screaming is not a good thing. And the actual information was that there was a camouflaged saltwater crocodile, and when it was noticed by the gorilla engaged in screaming at it, which is something that's been documented in the literature when gorillas encounter the species of crocodile within their environment. So most of our outcomes are not necessarily red in tooth and claw. Many of them can be a withdrawal or deus ex machina or some kind of other sort of third-party intervention. So and this quite often happens when animals are engaged in combat in the natural world. They tend to be more vulnerable to predators or other kinds of disruptions because they are not able to divide as much of their effort toward vigilance when they're dealing with something very, very, very proximate. And over we hear back routinely from teachers and parents and other kinds of learners the extent to which this tournament just absolutely captures the enthusiasm and engagement of learners of all ages. So students like lining up outside the classroom door to come in early to look at the brackets and talk about what happened the night before, or children repeatedly wanting to like recreate by acting some of the encounters they heard in the play-by-play. And this just goes to show how indelibly these kinds of stories and game contexts are reaching into the imagination and excitement of learners. An educator survey respondent said that they really appreciate all the resources, such as journal articles that connect to the topics we study in our biology class, and how the Twitter posts are both entertaining and lighthearted, as well as informational and educational. I also love being to show real scientists to my students. Thank you for all the work that goes into this. My students absolutely love it. And these are representative quotes. They're not just the kind of one-off that shows up. In the history of the tournament, we featured 548 different species. They come from across the tree of life. We have long since expanded beyond mammals to showcase many, many other species, and have been able to cite, hundreds of articles and journals, and really showcase very specific habitats, different conservation priorities, national parks across the world, and all sorts of important ecosystems. We talk about the physical and behavioral traits, the conservation and human impacts, ecosystem dynamics, interactions and impacts, species diversity, and the tree of life, and variation among individuals. And if you are an educator out there or somebody in science communication that pays attention to these, yes, these are all next generation science standard learning themes. And as we've heard back from teachers, we've really situated our curricular materials and our narratives toward those kinds of topics that are required to be taught to students, so that our content is harmonious with curricula and helps reinforce the principles that teachers are already sharing with their learners. We build story arcs both within the particular play-by-play and across the tournament. So events in one round can carry forward into the future. So injuries, we pay attention to gut passage time. We pay attention to how likely the animal is to be hungry or motivated for a predator encounter. We pay attention to zoonotic disease transmission and incubation times, the seasonality between the northern and southern hemisphere, and what is happening seasonally for the animals in these ecosystems. We are able to make great use of pop culture jokes that are happening. So right before this last tournament, there was widespread dialogue around Elmo hating Rocco the Rock, who's Zoe's pet rock and best friend. And this gave us a chance to highlight that Lycan was one of the combatants, and Elmo, who hadn't wanted to share a cookie with the rock, was now talking about using the kind of same sorts of language and points paralleled, instead was complaining about whether or not Lycan would be able to fight in a battle because it's just a plant. And of course, this was a chance for Zoe to say, no, lichen is not a plant, Elmo. Lichen is a composite organism of algae and fungi. So we have all these kinds of different principles we're able to teach. We have a lot of kind of memes and memories that emerge over the narratives. And I want to highlight here that one year we had a tag team division. So these were species that had a mutualistic relationship, and we revealed some of these combatants and that division on the National No One Eats Alone Day. So this is a school initiative to try and prevent bullying and social isolation, and really highlight tactics for anti-bullying. So No One Eats Alone Day allowed us a really great chance to talk about mutualisms in nature. One of the ways I think that the tournament has particularly been most impactful is as we've librarian Annalie Perry at ASU really expanded our reach by creating a library guide. So this is a .edu URL, which means that students in schools can visit it, and we curate a ton of resources about the tournament, educator materials, and direct students to reliable information about animals in nature. And what we found is that the number of page views has increased almost exponentially across time. There was a bit of a dip during March 2020 because people had a lot going on at that moment. But otherwise, we're just seeing a consistent expansion of use of these curated resources. And this is really happening importantly during the pre-tournament period. So the bracket releases about 2 weeks before the tournament begins, and this is a period where individuals can do research and make their predictions about who the champion is going to be. And this is really when we see, this pre-tournament period is really when we see learners engaging in their research. So, and it turns out that the bracket drop day is associated with changes in Google search activity. So this is an example I pulled from 2019, and it really shows that the peak hours of searches for these animals, and I've picked species examples like serval, markhor, ricali, and tenrec, because these are relatively less searched animals and not very, they tend to not be brand names or get mixed up with other things. And so what you really see is searches for these animals are peaking during school hours. The bracket released on Friday, so there's a little bump there. And then that Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday after the bracket release is when we really see just peak searching. And And we're seeing that this is specifically related to some of the other species that are in the bracket. So the related query response that Google provides, it really shows that the bracket is what is driving this phenomenon. And I think very excitingly, we don't release the results ahead of time to the teachers. So the teachers are playing right along with their students. And so this allows a really flipped classroom where the teacher and the students are kind of democratized. The teacher knows a lot more, but is a guide by the side, much more than a lecturer or somebody that's just providing already known information. They're all making their predictions together. We've had, as I mentioned, 10 tournaments, 10 champions. They tend to be fairly charismatic. Size definitely gives animals an advantage in this tournament, given the kind of structure of the game. And it began in 2013 as me as a scientist narrator and just really kind of a very small sort of operation. And yet today, it is this amazing collective of scientists, conservationists, artists, puppeteers, illustrators, graphic designers, librarians, teachers, there's a huge group of people that make this tournament possible year after year. And so how did we get here? And I think this is a big, important lesson for science engagement, which is that it starts small and things can grow slowly. And all of a sudden what you'll find is a decade later, it has become just a major campaign and initiative, but nothing starts out that way. So year 2, when people had a really good time the first year and they're like, all right, see you in 2014. I was like, yeah, I can't do this by myself. And I recruited 3 of the most engaged players to help me as scientist narrator. So this is Christy Luton, Josh Drew, and a great friend and colleague of mine, Chris Anderson, who I went to graduate school with at UCLA. And then it just snowballed from there. The American Society of Mammalogists started tweeting images from their collection. A team of tattoo artists out of Washington, D.C. messaged me and were like, can we do art of this piece? Yes, that would be amazing. I think my answer was had a bit more curse words because I was so excited. A high school student began just retweeting the official tournament play-by-plays and not all the trash talk. So that became an educator-safe account. And the Cleveland Museum of Natural History started tweeting out images from their collections of the combatants. It was just this amazing compounding. Teams of geneticists by Melissa Wilson and Ann Stone came on board in 2016. So we grew there. Then it expanded again. The Oxford Academic Press, Oxford University Press, contacted us and asked if we'd like them to curate a freely available collection of articles about the combatants. And we said yes, and they've continued to do that every year since 2017. So people can access key articles about these species that are usually behind a paywall. Rodent Roundtable was this spontaneous puppeteer show where they do a sport summary of what happens the night before battles. And this is a really, really great thing within the classroom. I already mentioned that the Lib Guide was started. We started the Facebook page. The conservation group, the Aldo Leopold Foundation, started doing inspirational commercial breaks. And we did a green screen video for the wild card battle, and it just continued to grow. And as it became this bigger phenomenon, more and more people showed up and said, I have this idea, can I contribute? Or what do you think about doing this? So we started making lesson plans and surveying our educators. We started providing summary statements as dispatches. We created Valentines, science-based Valentines. Grows. We translated the science-based Valentines into Spanish. We expanded the lesson plans for AP classrooms now that we knew what kind of classrooms were using it. And we started putting together art and visual art and language art lesson plans. And then now we've expanded to many more resources, including animal info pages for the combatants that are for the littlest learners or others that may not have time to do all the primary research themselves. And in this last year, we had, it being the 10th tournament, we had a very, very extensive calendar with special events, festivals, music videos, and more. So what might be in store for 2023? We want to do, we've really demonstrated that we can get people to care about animals. We got people we got people to cry about, slime eels at the bottom of the ocean. And so getting people to care is actually, it turns out, very possible in these kinds of settings. But we want to move from that caring to action. And so developing lesson plans and other kinds of resources within the battle narratives that help people think global and act local. So kind of really precipitate people looking into things that they can do the rest of the year that helps nature and animals. And I think we definitely have some exciting divisions planned for 2023, including a division of dad bods and a division of itty bitty comeback city, some of our smallest combatants that are usually eliminated quite early in the tournament. Maybe they'll last longer if they all get to be in their own division. So as we wind down, I know I'm a couple minutes over, but I want to just highlight that, like, if you build it, if you build things that get people excited and you welcome their contributions and you hear and listen to the feedback and implement, dissent with modification, it can continue to grow in really amazing ways. So a community can emerge. So shared experiences within a festival or momentous event context have particular cognitive impact. Being able to participate deeply, where you watch every single battle live or just read the summary catch up or just hear the outcome. This leads to an emergent communitas and really helps build repeat participation. And it is structured in a way that levels a playing field. So the best students at science aren't necessarily always going to do best at this tournament. So it democratizes the classroom. And we've seen different things spring out of this tournament that are self-continuing. So there's an MMM Halloween contest online, and for 2 years we'd get together once a week to watch movies. And there's now a group of holiday gift exchange among team members and longtime players, and just this really wonderful community. So this isn't, I think this is a really amazing example, but in many ways it's like lightning in a bottle. And like, how does March Mammal Madness ever happen again in, these kinds of, settings? And so the lessons from it, though, I think apply to any kind of science communication. So one, facts are never enough. You're not going to bring more people to the table by just sharing facts. So cognitively narrative-based education requires scientific information being integral to the story. And so what I really would encourage people to do is develop more story-based kinds of approaches for science communication. So much of science communication right now is based on kind of like voting outcomes, and that engages people that already have some familiarity or very kind of casual engagement, but doesn't build these kinds of sustainable communities. And as always, teamwork makes the dream work. So what we found is that if ever you can get your science engagement to have components that are social, feature animals, nature, and art, engage in narrative and illustration, bring together trusted experts, create a phenomena of collective experience, and generate a substantial amount of excitement, you're going to be setting yourself up for a great deal more success in your science engagement. And I'd like to think that maybe on a subconscious level, I've been familiar with a lot of this research for quite some time, but this wasn't necessarily always, that empirical evidence wasn't always consciously being picked for how we decided stuff. We had a much simpler kind of, guiding rule structure, guiding value structure. And it was, if it's fun, if it's accurate, and if it's inclusive, let's do it. And we've had opportunities to grow, to become more inclusive. I think we've always been fun and we've always prioritized accuracy, but continuing our growth attitudes for learning how to improve this, be more inclusive, and bring more people to the table has been one of our guiding principles throughout. And I want to say that it's quite important for me to engage in science engagement because I do my science on maternal and child health and lactation biology, and that's quite quite fantastic. I'm perennially curious about those dynamics, but it's not enough because I know too well that many people aren't able to just do their science. And so at the same time, it's important as a scholar for me to spend time improving science. And so one of the other areas that I've worked on with incredible colleagues is on addressing sexual harassment and sexual assault and gender biases and other kinds of biases that create more obstacles unfairly for many people that have been excluded and marginalized within academia. And we need to expand science. We need to get more of the general public excited about the scientific endeavor and understanding what is involved in the scientific endeavor. So that is one of the ways in which I've diversified my portfolio. So in conclusion, I want to thank every member of the MMM community, past, present, and future, the researchers we cite, the funders who support research, obviously a critical component, and everyone working toward One Health stewardship of our Earth. Thank you for attending this talk, and I look forward to your questions and the discussion that follows. Thank you.
That was so fun, Katie. I'm so excited to dive into audience questions. So now is the time that we'll be taking questions from the audience. And if you're watching this lecture live, now is the time to submit your questions in the chat. But I'm going to take advantage of being the moderator and actually ask you the first question. So my question is, where did this idea come from? It doesn't seem like the sort of topic of the tournament, like you were just saying at the end, is not the topic of your research. So where did this idea come from?
I can't hear you, Brianna. I don't know what's going on technically.
Oh,
I don't know if the audience can.
I don't know if, okay. So it looks like Ariel's telling me to exit and rejoin. So I'm going to try to, oh, Katie. So I think in the, Ariel's suggesting for you to exit and rejoin. Okay. So while Katie is doing that, I'd love to encourage folks to submit your questions in the chat. And when Katie's able to rejoin again, I look forward to asking her questions. I would love to also hear from, I've seen in the chat and some comments from teachers who participate in March Mammal Madness. It's fun to watch you talk to each other a little bit. And it's fun to kind of hear about your experiences using this in the classroom. And also, while we're waiting for Katie to jump back on, you can look at some of the links in the chat where the Leakey Foundation has posted links to the ASU guide to March Mammal Madness, as well as looking at some other links in the chat that have been posted. Just in general, more information about March Mammal Madness. And let's see. Also, just posted in the chat by the Leakey Foundation are the educational resources of the American Association of Biological Anthropologists. So that's a great thing we have some resources for biological anthropologists as well as other broader educational resources. And I see a question actually that came in from Cheryl asking, has the Smithsonian used March Mammal Madness? That's a really good question. Not to my knowledge, but I think it might be something that we might encourage. I'm trying to think if I recall whether the National Museum of Natural History's Twitter account has kind of played along a little bit with March Mammal Madness. I don't remember. So it looks like, I'm looking at the chat and it looks like folks can hear me. So hopefully once Katie is able to rejoin again, looks like she's back on. Hello, wonderful.
Yeah, sorry about that. Thanks everybody for your patience. For some reason, StreamYard is not loading on my laptop, but my talk,
Fun.
I made it through the talk, right? Everybody saw that?
Yes, absolutely. Could hear you just fine. The talk was wonderful. So
So
excellent.
it was only at the chat time that it dropped down. So I'm here now on my phone. Excellent.
Excellent. We are all set. Okay. So I'm still going to take privilege to ask the first question, which is, where did you get the idea for this tournament?
Oh yeah, so that's a great question. It was a Friday afternoon. It'd been a rough week, and it was like right before departmental happy hour, and so I just was on social media and I saw an animal bracket by BuzzFeed, and I had loved the basketball bracket as an undergraduate at the University of Washington. Like we would skip classes the first round of the tournament as 64 teams went to 32, and it was absolute bloodbath. It was so much fun to trash talk people's picks, and it was just this really great bonding thing. But it wasn't very present as a graduate student, shockingly. And so instead, it's something I hadn't done. And so I was like, oh, well, this animal bracket could be really fun for the lab and be a nice chance for us to like kind of like, chit chat and have fun. And so I printed it out and we sat down and started filling it out. And it was only 16 species. And it was whichever one was cutest. And it was based on voting. And I was like, give me your brackets back. I'll be back in, give me an hour. And so, and then some of the students and postdoc were also like looking up animals, and we just like basically came up with a bracket that more accurately mimicked the basketball bracket. And it was really based on adaptations and what would happen in the ecosystem. And I just thought up those rules that afternoon and put together this cheesy little YouTube video about it and planned to start it on Monday and put it on my blog. It was really, really janky. And that was back in 2013. Like bio Twitter was a totally different it was a totally different scene. And so everybody just kind of played, and like there was no schedule, and it was pretty spontaneous. And the really funny thing was I didn't expect it to take off, and then it did. And I had scheduled to go do some pilot data collection with meerkats in the Kalahari for spring break. And so I'd have to go and run around with meerkats during the day and then wait until the middle of the night for the internet to work. And my friend and colleague, Chris Anderson, he would like send me information that he looked up in the States and be like, you could talk about this. And so he was really helpful because I had such limited internet access. And that's how it just kind of spontaneously started.
I love that. That's fantastic. It looks like the next question is from Camilla, who asks, is there any way to test skills learned from March Mammal Madness? Please explain how this is done.
Yeah, that's a really great question. And what we, right now, because of the ethics of research around this, we've really focused on surveying the teachers, because teachers are really, really knowledgeable of how their students are learning. They have really good insights into it, and it doesn't require, like we're asking the teachers about stuff. If we want to do the research with the students, which we do want to do that, it requires, parental permissions, and we'd want to do a much more structured thing in the classroom. And so I imagine that I will expand, we as a team will spend a bit more time, going after grant funding for this. So right now, this is entirely volunteer, nonprofit. I mean, it's not for profit. We generate no revenue. Everything's just kind of created as a gift to the world. And so there hasn't really been the funding or the bandwidth to allocate to the more kind of pre and post testing of learners. One of the things that I found with our feedback from educators that I think is just really, really exciting is it's used a lot in special ed settings, because it helps students learn to think in kind of, in contingencies, and to emotionally regulate about like it's not all or nothing, right? So the bracket's not all or nothing. You make some accurate predictions and you're wrong about some, and that's great and okay. And this comes in quite frequently from our special ed instructors. And so I think, what with our surveys, right, we get thousands of responses, and we've got just this incredibly rich data about what students are learning, or how They will spontaneously refer to the tournament like the next year, or write to their teachers over the summer about going to the zoo and seeing combatants, and talked about, and so we haven't created a structure to rigorously interrogate those kinds of learning outcomes. It's definitely a direction that we'd be eager to go into, pending bandwidth and funding.
Yeah, absolutely. Being involved in a project that does surveys with minors, it's definitely a different level of bandwidth in school settings. So yeah. Rebecca asks, how do you balance communicating to general audiences as well as scholarly audiences?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I would say at the first, one of the citations early in my presentation that was kind of talking about that like pyramid of scholarly activities resting upon a deeper foundation of principles and values and vision. In that publication, we really kind of unpacked different members of the teams, the anthropologists of the team's approach to science engagement, and how what we actually find is that March Mammal Madness isn't the only thing that any of us do. We have many different kinds of things that we do. So as my career has grown, I tend to try and hit different stakeholder audiences over, kind of moving 2-year periods. So my work on infant nutrition and infant development has, important implications for anthropologists, psychologists, and animal behaviorists, but it also translates into the medical field. So I work on knowledge translation toward pediatricians and neonatologists and OBGYN. And so I'll make sure that I have opportunities to engage with those audiences, or policymakers, or, I've given talks at the CDC and NIH, museum audiences. And so it's really about, we should be thinking in terms of diversifying our portfolios among all dimensions. And so I try, and now that I've done that for a few years, I've realized that maintaining a schedule where I travel 37 to 40 weeks of the year is hard. And so I had decided to pull back on that. And then 2020 really helped me lock in that decision. And so I think it's just a matter of, if you return to your values and vision and mission as a scholar, you'll make sure that you're not necessarily putting all of your eggs into one basket, or maybe you are putting all of your eggs into one basket, and that's the basket that's really important for you.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's about your values. So here's a question from Kyle. How did STOAT become the default unit of measurement? I've always wondered.
All right, that's a great question, Kyle. And so what happened was, and we have the very, very precise details of this in our eLife article that came out in 2021, where there's an entire paragraph with the citations dedicated to this. But what really happened was there was a battle between a stoat and another species. And Christy Luton basically calculated how many times bigger than the stoat the other combatant was. So, it was just kind of this spontaneous stoat conversion. And then while she was doing research for a later battle, she found this article from the 1800s where somebody said, this species is about twice the size of a stoat. So we basically figured out that the stoat metric has a deep heritage back to natural history from the 1800s. And so that just, it kind of became this running joke. And then, Mark Kissel created the Shiny Stoat app. And then Spencer, one of our community members, has created an even more elaborate stoat conversion. The artist created a stoat conversion chart. And so it's kind of, we have a t-shirt where we talk about March Mammal Madness is totally awesome. And it's just kind of grown out of that.
I love that. That's fantastic. And I bet a lot more people know what stoats are now after using that as the unit of measurement.
Yeah. And it's really fun because, felids and canids, cats and dogs, get so much glory among the carnivores, but many of us have, a deep affection for the mustelids, just because they're just so scrappy, and they accomplish so much above what you'd necessarily expect of them, that we really like to have ongoing jokes that really highlight mustelid friends.
Fantastic. Here's a question from Jacqueline. How do you choose the animals each year?
That's a great question. With difficulty, and it's getting harder with every year. So in general, we have an idea file and we have like some division ideas, and then we have some really cool species, right? So as new findings come out or new species get described or something happens, we'll like, put species in, and then we'll see if they kind of fit into a category. Like, animals that are red was one that we used one year, or we have an idea for a division and then we go looking for species that fit into that. Now, all right, so that's the first step. Then what we do is we try and make sure that we have kind of a breadth of tax, like that we show species from across the tree of life, that we don't reuse the same species year after year, that they, are from across different geographic regions. We don't want it to only be, just one continent. Sometimes we have exceptions, like we had the North America division, but we had a very particular reason that we wanted to highlight that. And then one of the other things we have to do is we have to go into the literature, and for species that are expected to go far in the tournament, we have to make sure there's enough research about them to sustain stories. And this lesson was so painfully learned when we did the giant forest hog. So it's one of the biggest pig hog species Suidae. It's giant forest hog. And there's like one population survey and that's it. And like, this thing made it to the final championship battle. And so it was like, we knew nothing about it. So writing battles about it was really, really hard. And, one of the nice things though, is as an anthropologist, I started going into the kind of like cultural literature. So kind of looking into what local peoples knew about the animal, or like myths that they had about the animal. Or at one point it was just like, the FA people call it buku, and like just anything to make some content. So ever since that, we go back and make sure that there's enough scientific knowledge to be able to talk a bit about it. And so that's how the species get, it's kind of this complex decision tree where we have to check off a lot of boxes. And then, as certain divisions come together, we want to make sure that like you don't want to have, and many of these lessons were learned by stumbles in the past, but like in one division we had like a fox versus deer matchup, and then in another division, because of how we'd seeded it, we ended up with another fox versus deer battle. And you're like, oh, well. So we just leaned into that, and we basically wrote identical battles for both of them to give people like obvious deja vu as a joke. And luckily our community, they roll with us with those kinds of things. They, I talked about, we have a certain structure and we always play around with it a little bit. And most of the time people are ready to roll with the divergences from typical.
Nice.
Yeah.
Here's the question from Jenna. Any hints for this year's combatants?
Well, if you were looking at the talk, and I did speed up there at the end because I was worried about how much I was going to go over. We do have two divisions that I already announced. So we're going to have Itty Bitty Comeback City. So these are going to be our really small, 14th, 15th, and 16th and wild card seeded species that usually only have one appearance a year because they get scarfed or hide very quickly. We're gonna bring them back to be in a division with each other. So hopefully some of those will get to stick around a little bit longer. And then we also talked about a division of dad bods. So what might that mean? So often, so many species, especially in mammals, the mothers are doing the heavy lifting of infant care. But if we look beyond mammals, we see, and even some mammals, engaged in quite extensive paternal care or other kinds of adaptations for paternal investment. So those would be things that you might want to start speculating about.
Fun. I appreciate those hints. So Maria asks, what are your top SciComm tips?
Great question. And it really, it should be fun, it should be accurate, and it should be inclusive. And we tend to be really quite good at knowing what's accurate, understanding that accurate isn't the same thing as precise or comprehensive, right? So scholars, we love getting into the nitty-gritty details in the weeds that nobody else like wants to go there with us, right? Like you're not doing SciComm for the other 5 experts in your particular tiny niche, right? You're doing SciComm for a different stakeholder audience, right? People that know less than you about that particular topic, but know a lot about other things. And so I would say, appreciate the knowledge other people bring to the table. Do things that cultivate curiosity and be excited about their curiosity. Make sure things are fun. That can be also something that scholars might trip up on a little bit on occasion. So a way to do that is find ways to make it a game. Because what we think is fun is not always what everybody thinks is fun, but in general, games are a good guide. And then just continuously work on understanding how to better deliver content that brings more people to the table. There's certain spaces that some of us are just never going to be a trusted individual or a safe individual, or like it'll take a lot of time to build the relationships to achieve that. So build partnerships with others that are already doing work in those spaces, and help them with what they need help with, and find ways to make what you've got going on worthwhile for them to participate and contribute to, and build it that way. So there's lots of ways to achieve inclusivity, but all of them require a lot of thought and care and learning and listening.
I love that. I particularly love the idea that it doesn't always have to be us as scientists necessarily, and that, finding trusted partners can be a very fruitful avenue of science communication.
Absolutely.
So Elizabeth asks, as a children's book writer, this resonates in so many ways. Do you find kids transitioning from the Who Would Win series from Scholastic and filling in a broader science space?
Yeah, I don't, it's interesting because the Who Would Win series came out after we started our tournament. And and I try to make sure that we remain independent from it. And one of the things that I've noticed about, where I have looked at it, is the Who Would Win is reaching and gives a lot of information about the adaptations of those species, which is great. Talks about their habitats, talks about their, physical traits, their behavioral traits, and it's all really wonderful. And I think it provides some really good information to the kids that know about it, who are doing research for their bracket. But my understanding is those books don't actually give you an outcome. And and part of that's because it fundamentally it really depends. It depends on what habitat they're encountering each other in. It depends on what their motivations are. It depends. And so we're really focused on creating that narrative of what might happen, and sometimes it's the unlikely outcome. And some of these things can be really, really stressful, and especially when you get to the championship, right? So this last year, our champion was a pride of lionesses versus a grandmother resident orca in the Puget Sound of Washington State. And I mean, these are like, people had, their favorites. These had become characters. They had story. They had, they had all sorts of endearing. Well, the orca had endearing traits that had been, not created, but described. Right, grandmother orcas do so much for their family members. They have such deep knowledge. They're so, they're so threatened within the Pacific Northwest, and so. You want to honor those potential champions at the finale, and how do you write a battle of orcas versus lionesses, knowing that they do not generally encounter each other on the same substrate, right? And so I was quite excited this last year because I was able to find all sorts of science where a scenario could be written that was anchored to actual observed behavior of both populations, and that was quite exciting. And so we really try to find a way to tell a story. And so it's not just the Who Would Win. That's the starting point. But over that month of tournament battles, we're really telling a story of a hero's journey across these different habitats and through these different encounters.
I love that. That's fantastic. It's, yeah, more than the facts, like you were saying.
Yeah.
Question from Commander Orion. Do you ever feel guilty about the win of red kangaroo over harpy eagle?
I mean, no, I never feel guilty about that. All right. I feel sadness and regret because I really wanted it to be the harpy eagle. And when so the subset of the organizers, we determine the outcomes and we do it before the bracket releases. And this is quite important because we don't want fan chatter or player enthusiasm to unfairly influence the outcomes. So we calculate what it's going to be and we run the random number generator. And so by the time the bracket releases to the public, we on the inside know who the champion is. And we plan out storyboards to create the story arcs to explain the journey through the tournament. And when this is the only time we've ever done this. And we got to the final battle and it's red kangaroo versus harpy eagle. We calculate the probability and maybe we're even slightly generous to the harpy eagle because we really wanted, it would be so exciting to have a bird champion. So we ran the random number generator and it said red kangaroo. And we're like, and one of the other organizers, I won't say who it was, but they were like, best 2 out of 3.
Nice.
Again, the only time we've done this, we ran the random number generator again, and the RNG is like, did I stutter? Red kangaroo. And we're like, okay. I mean, to be fair, that is the more probable outcome. So we were there rooting for the harpy eagle with you. We honored her with a satirical song, and we're very sad that she was not the official winner, but she was the champion of the people's hearts, and lives forever in that way.
Oh, wonderful. So I think we have time for one last question.
Okay.
And so let's see what the last question is going to be. Just dun, dun, dun. All right, last question from Cheryl. How can the March Mammal Madness activity work for different ages? Does the teacher create lessons that are age appropriate for the animals?
This is a great question, and I'm excited to answer it because we actually have created different lesson plans for the next generation science standards for high school, middle school, and elementary school. So, and all of them are available as a free open educational resource on the LibGuide website. They get updated every year for the new divisions and the new species. We've got life sciences lessons plans, many we have ecosystems lesson plans, we have tree of life lesson plans, we have language arts lesson plans, we have visual arts lesson plans, we have social studies lesson plans, all of which are downloadable and editable. So teachers can modify them for whatever works best for their classroom. We really want to make the resources as accessible and useful to educators as we can. And this has one of the key things that we wanted to do the Wild North America was to showcase specific food webs in different national parks and compare and contrast intact versus disrupted food webs and design that lesson plan with those kinds of ecosystem dynamics themes of NGSS in mind. So we also have a lesson plan specifically for 4th graders to get students excited about the every kid outside or every kid outdoors. And this is the every 4th grader in the United States can get a national parks pass that gets them and 3 family members and a car into national parks, wildlife conservation areas, all public federal lands, and helps students basically explore what are the public lands in their home state or nearby states, and also think about kind of aspirational, national parks that they might want to visit some later day if it's not nearby. And so we have a lesson plan that talks about the history of the national parks, the original stewards and indigenous nations that are involved in those lands and have deep heritage there, and really get kids excited about knowing that this is part of what we have access to, and in order to continue valuing it, sometimes making it tangible and visited is a key component of that.
It's just, I was lucky enough to take advantage with my fourth grader this year of the free National Parks Pass, and it was really fun. So we're going to wrap up. It was just so exciting to hear you talk about the background, the social science research, what goes into March Mammal Madness, and just what an amazing effort. The recording of tonight's program is now available for replay on the Leakey Foundation's website and YouTube channel, and we hope you will watch it again and share it with your friends. Thank you, everybody, for watching.
Thank you so much for having me. And thank you to everybody that makes all of this possible.